Welcome to the World Wild Podcast. I'm Miles Irving, and I'll be introducing
Fred Gillam
in a few minutes. Very excited to have Fred on the podcast. And just by way of kind of leading up really to some of the topics we discuss, or maybe even pulling some of the threads together, I wanted to share some ideas which could be summed up with the line of an Elvis Costello song. And I think we might put a link to this song underneath the podcast page. So
the song is called Allison, and the lyric is "My aim is true."
So I reckon that's an archery metaphor, and the guy's talking about a lady that he's in love with called Allison, and he's indicating that he's not messing around. He really does want to pursue that genuine relationship with her, I guess. So talking of archery metaphors, there's a thing that perhaps we don't talk about very much these days because it's not such common parlance to talk about, here we go, sinning. So, I don't know if anyone's childhood or background or cultural heritage has much going on around that word. But I'm a bit of a biblical scholar on the side, and I like to dig around in the original meanings of some of these words. And actually, the Greek word for sin is not really what you'd think. It's basically an archery metaphor. So the idea is that if you sin, your aim is ever so slightly not true. So, in other words, you're looking at the target, but something is getting in there which distorts the aim, so that the arrow just goes slightly wide of the target. But if you think about it, having gone wide of the target, if you were thinking about the target, for example, being true north, and you had a compass that was ever so slightly off, then the further you went, the further away from the correct direction of true north you'd be getting. And the more I think about it, the more I think that the sort of distortions that are going on, which end up leading us away from life and connection and participation in the biosphere and heart-to-heart connections with other people, where we don't hide and we're able to really get the sense and the experience of who other people really are, et cetera, where it's all going wrong is based, I am going to suggest, in a kind of hijacking of our appetites. Because, another way you could look at it is that an aim in that sense, what we pursue is like a hunger and an appetite. And if you look at the global industrial food system, it is so rife with examples of people's appetite being hijacked, whether it's by the kind of addictive things that we touch on in the podcast today, or just by just plain skullduggery of deception, putting flavor chemicals into things which make you tap into a hunger for something that isn't actually in the food. There's a whole book about that called the Dorito Effect, which is mentioned because that guy wrote his book kind of in collaboration with Fred Gillam, and I'm afraid I can't remember his name, but we'll probably have him on the podcast. So there's an example of just directly an appetite, which is so true in the case of animals and including human beings. When we are in a intact relationship, where there's a sort of a relationship of integrity between us and our surroundings, we, like all other animals, will know what it is we need to eat, and we will have a hunger for that, and we'll pursue it. But when the appetites are distorted, they keep leading us further and further off true north, as it were, and we eat stuff that isn't good for us. But also, this is actually a biblical notion in itself, we eat bread that doesn't satisfy. We eat food which leaves us still hungry. So I think if we take that just that example in itself as a metaphor, to eat food that doesn't satisfy is a really good metaphor for all of the other kind of things which we're doing, like with industrial consumer culture, where we're seeking, for example, a public persona, like some kind of public image where people would think a certain thing of us. Then I'll be happy, then I'll be satisfied. That sort of thing is obviously also leading us far off true north. And, then again, whatever it is, the appetite for possessions, status, I don't know, dysfunctional relationships, all of it. It's basically because we aim at something else. And I suppose the point is, like, how do we end up correcting that aim? What's the remedy? I'm not sure I'm going to be able to map that one out for you in any kind of complete sense. But I guess the thing is to start looking at the bread that does satisfy. And that is pretty much a solid theme running through the podcast this week, with our sort of neurophysiology and the compounds that work in our brain that get us to seek after things which do make us feel good and actually do us good. There we are. I'll kind of leave that thought to sort of mix in with everything else that's said in the conversation with Fred. And I'll just introduce Fred now briefly. And the funny thing is, the main thing that I would want to say about Fred, apart from he's a very clever guy and very interesting guy that's really widely read and gives me all sorts of brain stimulation every time I speak to him, is Fred is really deeply knowledgeable about medicinal mushrooms, which is why it's kind of hilarious. We barely even touch on the subject in this podcast. So I should say from the outset, tune in on another occasion very soon when I talk to Fred about that subject. But for some reason, we just talked about almost everything but Fred runs a medicinal mushrooms conference once a year in Wiltshire, and be well worth getting along to that if that's something of interest to you. You would learn a lot, as I did the year before last when I attended. And Fred's also got a background in forestry, which is another thing we don't talk about at all. But there we are. I guess the thing is, the thing about these podcasts is you get to meet the person in the context of this conversation that we have, and that's the most important thing. We're not trying to be like a library that gives you the definitive statement or Wikipedia or something. We're just introducing you to someone new, and then if you want to know more about them, you can follow that up yourself. Okay, well, that's it. So without further ado, we will get on to the conversation with Fred Gillam.
Yeah, I mean, I think we've lost the plot with children's television, really.
It's also banal.
And funnily enough, I've been talking to Andy. Have you seen what Andy put up on the Foraging for Kids thing? He did this thing called Wild News. I think he might be onto something. It's quite funny, but we're talking about populating it, actually doing it as a thing, and populating it with stories from different angles. You know, like
what's the bit? How does it work?
Well, the first thing he does is he just says this is wild news, and he's sitting somewhere, and then it kind of goes. It's deliberately like as low budget as possible. The first thing, and then it's just a photograph, a grainy photograph of a duck with a youngster, and he goes, "Yeah, so for the next little while, you're going to see these mother ducks with their babies," and it's just, and then there's some daffodils. So daffodils, but it's just like a sketch of what could happen.
Yeah.
But I think the idea that you'd have some wild news, but it'd all be done in a kind of slightly wacky, funny way.
Yeah.
And it ends up with him saying that now the weather is supposed to be read by this guy called Greg, but Greg is a cut-out cardboard photograph on a stick, and then the map that he's supposed to be using is a geological map. Yeah. And he's going, Andy, this low budget stuff, I can't work with this. He said, that's not even a proper map. It's a geological map. I can't do the weather from. Oh, all right then. Okay, I'll just work with what I've got. And it's pretty funny actually. But I think there might be something in it. You know, we perhaps could put together. You know, we've got enough oddballs in our.
Yeah, well, we're all a bunch of oddballs. I think it's or are we? You know, are we odd? I don't think we're odd.
Well, no, I mean, I always do this business with the people that come on my foraging walks, especially kids. And I say, you know, do you know that? Do you know what? Well, I ask them where food comes from, and they give me all sorts of clever answers, but they'll never get the one I'm after, which is that food comes from here. And then I say, well, you know, every other organism just gets food from here, apart from these weirdos. I don't know if you've seen them around, but they're like these modern humans. Mm-hmm. They get their food from somewhere else all the time, and it comes in packets on trains, in ships, and from these funny things called shops. You know, no total weirdos. No other species behaves like that at all. I said, but a good job. Good thing is, you know, it is possible to be normal. So here's a dandelion. Eat this dandelion. Hey, anybody feeling normal yet? Kids, you feeling a bit more normal, and so on. And then by the end of it, I said, well, you just want to go home and make sure you kind of do something normal every day, because it's hard work being a weirdo and so on. So try and turn it on their heads. Yeah, turn it on its head. Yeah. So yeah, that's true. And with adults, because kids think that's funny, especially if they're on a council estate or something. But like with adults at a festival, they love it. They're just like, wow, I am normal. They love being told they're normal.
Yeah.
They do a bit of foraging. Because it can be a bit of a burden, as you say, or as you indicate, to feel that we're the odd ones out. But we're not the odd ones out in terms of evolution and ecology.
Certainly not the odd ones out.
We are profoundly normal. We're so normal it's boring.
Yeah, we're the ones who didn't go weird in the first place, kind of thing. It's strange.
Or that we accidentally managed to be normal, having grown up in an industrial consumer context. How did that happen? Yeah.
That's a really good point. It's something to ponder, isn't it? What is that drive that enables us to see through that and have an instinct that steers us away from that?
Well, I've got a bit of a brief from Joel, who edits the podcast, and he tells me I need to get people's story at the beginning a bit more often than I do. Yeah. So could we have your story about how you became a normal organism, please, Fred?
God, that's a deep one, isn't it? That's a really deep one.
Why aren't you weird, Fred? What was it about your background?
I am weird some of the time. I'm kind of a weird normal hybrid, I think.
Yeah.
I think that's how it works.
Okay.
I had a pretty lucky upbringing, I think, but there is an element of something that is encoded into people, and I realised this a few years ago. It sounds a bit cosmic, but I had this light bulb moment, and I suddenly remembered that when I was a really small child, the first things that I can remember, the very, very first things that I remember, are going out to the garden and stuffing my head into dahlia blooms, okay, and trying to smell them. And again, and they don't have a rosy fragrance, but they have lots of interesting smell. I remember rubbing the leaves, and I remember there was what I would now describe as a sort of cloying scent coming from the leaves, and I remember seeing the twigs in front of my eyes. And I also then, must be not that long after that, maybe a year or so later, because we're talking back into the 70s where kids just went everywhere. I grew up on a council estate until I was 9 years old, in the middle of a town. So all the kids in the street used to play football out on the road. I was never a football kid, right? It didn't appeal. So I used to go and walk on my own, and I used to rob people's front gardens. I used to steal the seeds from their shrubs and take them home and put them in little manila envelopes, knocking about. So I used to put them in these little brown manila envelopes. And my dad was a bit of a gardener, so in his spare time at that time, because he worked elsewhere, he would tell me what they were. And I'd learn to write them, on the packets. Okay, I'd learn to write the words. So I had all these little packets of seeds.
Your dad must have been good to be able to recognise those seeds, just not with the plant,
Yeah, and it was all kinds of stuff. It was Californian lilac, and it was the shrubs that were all the way down the road in people's gardens, because kids used to just wander about. We used to take ourselves for a walk for a couple of miles with a few mates. Sure, you did the same at one time, and and then rock up home 5 hours later. Kids these days just don't do that. It would be seen in our society as extremely dangerous and weird.
Well, mine do.
Good. I'm glad, because I think they would inevitably, you're their dad, and they're probably going to inherit that same normality, hopefully, from you. So there I was out there. I had a thing that made me explore nature really close up. I always wanted to literally have the details right in front of my face and look at the tiny details. And for some reason, that tiny micro world was my sort of big world. I've still got it today. I'm still the same, and I'm still out there collecting things and wanting to identify them, wanting to understand what makes them tick and what makes them different to other things. And so that's something I think is built into me. And that's part of my personality. I don't think because I'm thinking back to the first things I did out in the street, you know, 4 years old, 5 years old, whatever. I don't think that's so much nurture as nature. I think that was an inherent thing. But then we were lucky. Because when I got to 9 years old, my dad jacked the job he was doing in, and he went off to be the head gardener on a country estate. And we moved there. We had the gardener's cottage, which was attached onto this big old Georgian mansion house. He got lucky. He landed his dream job for a few years. And he was a great head gardener. You know, we had these great houses that grew. They had Victorian grapevines in them, and the trunks on them would have been big enough to, you know, turn a bowl out of. The variety we grew was Black Hamburg. And he did everything in a really traditional way. So some people listening to this may be fairly horrified to hear that, you know, for fertilizer every 2 years, because there were 2 big vines in the grape houses, he would dig a pit alternating years at the base of the grapevine and bury a whole sheep. So we had a sheep farm next to us, and when they had a sheep that died of natural causes or whatever, you know, in the spring, that sheep would be brought in, buried in this pit, and that would be the food for the vines for 2 years as it decomposed.
Wow.
You know, stuff like that. So it was old-fashioned ways. There was a walled garden where we grew fruit and vegetables for the manor, but obviously we grew them for ourselves as well. There was an orchard, and there was also a secret garden. There was a hidden garden outside the walled garden. There was a little patch that there was kind of no way into it, but it's a remnant of an earlier garden. And, you know, as kids, it was fun to find our way into it. And we had this secret place to go and hang out and play in. And it was really something special. And I remember one day, we had this huge beech tree at the bottom of the garden, which is kind of how I got into mushrooms, because the mushrooms that came up around the beech tree, I got poisoned by them when I was 14, which is what led to that whole journey.
Oh, no.
Yeah. But I remember my dad one day calling me out and saying, I wonder who lived here a long time ago. And I looked at him and he said, because I've found their treasure. Okay. And we went down to that beech tree and he scraped away the earth. And it was for real. You know, somebody had dumped something there. God knows what it was. And it might have been to do with a funeral urn or something. I don't know. But there was this pile of gemstones.
What?
All kinds of crystals and gemstones. About an inch deep and about maybe 2 feet across, and we were scraping away, pulling the soil out and pulling out all these polished crystals, and it was insane. So I had this crystal collection that we dug up at the bottom of the beech tree in the garden, you know, all kinds of weird stuff in it. But it was a strange place to live. There were lots of really powerful old customs and traditions that were still on the go in a big way back in the early 70s, and that was what I grew up with.
Where was it again, Fred? Sorry, did you?
The village where I grew up is called All Cannings. It's about, as the crow flies, it's about a 4 to 5 mile walk straight across the hills from here.
Right.
And it's an interesting place, you know, if you're interested in social history, because back in the 1830s, when this land went up into rebellion, because the threshing machines had been invented, and the people who worked with horses on the land basically set up a rebellion to go and smash the mechanised farm machinery because it was depriving them of their jobs.
So these were Luddites, or
no?
This
was called the Swing Riots. This period. Okay, and it was 18.
Luddites was the looms and so on, wasn't it? It was the weavers.
It coincided with the weavers to some extent, overlapped with them, and there was a big connection because both the weavers and the horsemen had unofficial and illegal craftsmen's guilds. Unlike the guilds of the City of London, these were collectives of workers who either worked in the mills or on the land, and they organised themselves into pockets and conducted this act of rebellion because basically back in 1832, if you worked on the land, you worked with horses. We didn't have any tractors. Okay, everything was horsepower that required everything we would do by mechanisation today was either a wheel turned by a river, pretty much, or it was horses dragging things around the fields and pulling vehicles around. And these inventions that were coming about during this industrialization meant that one farm could do a job that it previously had done with 30 horsemen on the land, with just 3 or 4. And so they were losing their income, and most of them had places to live that were tied to the farms. They lost their livelihood, they lost their homes, and they were literally migrating to London to try and ply their trade and becoming, horse-drawn cab drivers and all sorts of things in London. But then the people of London turned against them and said they were foreign labour and that they were trying to undercut the people who were members of the guilds of the City of London. So they weren't welcome there either. This weird idea that people from the countryside going into London were considered foreigners and foreign labour. And so they were disenfranchised completely from society. And they set up groups. In a lot of cases, there was one very famous group called the Waltham Blacks who lived in Waltham Forest. And they were basically the local horsemen and ploughmen, and also the local, tinkers, tailors, cobblers, nailers, the people who were just being driven into poverty. And they set up their own bands in the woods and lived there, separate from their families. And a lot of them were involved with smuggling contraband from the coast. They were smuggling brandy and things like that from ships coming in from the Caribbean, using the Green Lane network, the droveway network around the country. So these people became outlaws, and they were involved with leading the rebellion, essentially, a bit like the Luddites. And they would turn up in public with their faces blacked, wearing rags and tatters, like in the mummers plays that go on, around Christmas today, which has got a link to that tradition. And the Waltham Blacks, in particular, elected a king, a forest king, who they named after a novel by a lady called Aphra Behn. And the novel's a couple of hundred years earlier, and the novel is the tale of King Oronuko, and that's what they named their king, Oronuko. And he was an African noble who was taken into slavery and ended up working on the plantations in the Caribbean. And then he led an uprising, he led a rebellion, and led the people out. And you can see why they chose this black. And they blacked faces because they felt their own plight was very similar to the people they were meeting on the ships. The pirate ships that were bringing the brandy for them were people who'd fled slavery to go pirating because there was more dignity.
Right. So it's kind of like workers' solidarity, into international workers' solidarity almost.
So much so, this is bonkers, right? So much so that our government passed an act of Parliament called the Black Act, which made it illegal to black one's faces in public. And it was treason, and you could be hung or deported for blacking your face in public. And they also suspended habeas corpus. So they brought in martial law. Habeas corpus, show me the body. So in other words, you could be arrested and tried without evidence. And the army were brought in to police the villages. And the Pewsey Vale, this is leading our story all the way back to where I grew up, was one of the epicenters. It was the epicenter in the West Country. So the village of Allcannings, where I grew up, all the folk stories and tales of hauntings and all the things that surround that village are all pretty much connected to the stories of the rebellion and the people of the Horsemen's Word who led it. The whole thing is totally fascinating, but there are weird parallels with the modern time. We're going through another revolution now. That was about industrialization, and this one's more to do with the changes that are coming about through technology and AI.
Yeah.
But, it's causing another churning of the organization of society.
But yeah, no, it's funny that you should have raised this whole kind of specter of people's livelihood being wrecked by the technological developments, because we were actually talking about this on the podcast that went out last week with Leanne Townsend. Yeah, we got quite into that, like the sort of smart farming thing that's being developed.
Yeah.
where no one actually needs to go there.
Yeah.
You're just remotely watching it and sending a little drone down there or a little machine that goes and does the job. And it's just, you know, it's just like, you know, it reminds me of a Dylan song where he says, when you think that you've lost everything, you find out you can always lose a little more, you know.
Mm-hmm.
You think like we surely couldn't take this to yet another level, but it seems that we can, like the level of, you know, just not, it isn't just, what I think is, it isn't just dehumanizing things, it is de-organisming things.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So this mechanical thing takes yet another stride into the space previously occupied by organic or social systems, you know.
Yeah. That's an interesting one, actually. Just pondering that, how that feels. You know, this is the thing. We're people, I think, the first place I go is not to think about how that works. It's how does it feel if I put myself into that space? That's the first place I go. And then I think about it. Okay, I think about what that means. But I think a lot of people don't. I think there's quite a few people who go straight into thinking about it. There I am. I'm placing myself in sort of a conjectural future situation, and I'm thinking, how does it feel? I can't even put it into words. It's like there's no part of my life that extends into any of those processes. I'm completely sidelined, and presumably, you know, I think this idea that there's a leisure society that, you know, it's been put forward before, isn't it? You know, it's such a load of nonsense. If people don't have a role to play in society, not only do they become disenfranchised, but those who are pulling the strings are going, why do we need these people? Why should we? You know, they're actually an encumbrance. They're not doing anything. They're not producing anything we need. And so this is what happened with the horsemen. They just weren't needed. And so they weren't supported by society anymore because they weren't needed. Okay? And that's how they lost their livelihoods and descended into poverty and sickness and all the other stuff that goes along with that. And that's what I see. What I see is the more that technology and AI takes over those kinds of traditionally really physical roles where people need to be present, in contact, organically making decisions and in communion with the things they're working with. Once people are taken out of that part of the equation, they don't really have anywhere to go. You know, they're not all going to retrain and become IT professionals. There's only so many IT professionals the world needs. That's going to be taken over by AI as well. You know, it's not a particularly utopian vision of the future that I hold, I have to say, at the moment, if we go down that road. I think it's so important that people reconnect with the land and their hands, using their hands, working with natural materials, connecting with the plants themselves. You know, we're foragers, but that's only one way we connect with plants. So I also make things from plant materials. I make things out of wood, and, you know, I teach people simple survival skills like making cordage out of plant fibers and things that require their physical involvement, their senses being used to tell whether things are going right or not, or adjust the process. You know, and then there's the whole thing of becoming sensitive to the healing properties of plants, understanding that, not only understanding that they can be used like chemistry sets, like, you know, growing medicines that grow out of the ground but are really like pills in a bottle, because they're not. You know, it's about understanding that the healing properties of plants are connected to the difficulties they face in the places that they grow and the way that they adapt to get around those difficulties. So there are some deeper connections that can be made.
What you're saying there with the plants' intricate and complex chemistry being a consequence of their need to deal with the conditions in their particular geological, climate, ecological situation. It really means that plant, being as it is, constitutes a response to that place. I just think that's quite interesting.
Definitely.
And somehow then us being in the situation that we're in, we take that on as an ally to facilitate us having a response. It's kind of a ready-made one, you know, that here's this, and it's not even a single thing, is it? As you say, it's not a magic bullet. It's a sophisticated pattern of possible responses and so on. That when we ingest it into our bodies, that chemical complexity gives us like a whole toolkit, really, for want of a better metaphor.
Something that's uniquely adapted to the surroundings. That it's. I don't want to use the word evolved because it could be a little bit contentious, but it's getting into the sciencey realm. It's about phenotypes. It's about the ability to switch genes on and off to respond to different situations. And so, for example, you get a plant that normally grows in quite humid, moist conditions, and it's put into a drier, more arid than usual setting, and it encounters pests that might maybe want to draw on its sugary sap as a source of food, and it finds that its cells are not as well armored against that in that situation because it's a drier setting, but the whole thing is a bit more sort of wilted and flaccid, and it's much more prone to predation from aphids and things like that. So it has to change. It has to do some gene switching in order to toughen up its cell walls, or to maybe make a more divided root system that's able to be more efficient in order to take up more water, to keep yourself more pumped up. So physiologically, the plants change in very intricate ways, don't they? The sap can become less sugary and more bitter to deter certain predators in certain conditions. Or, we find with plants that produce alkaloids, like the deadly nightshade, that in arid, sunny, dry conditions, it produces a lot more toxic alkaloids than it does in really damp environments. And we presume that's because it's going to encounter more predation in those circumstances, so it makes itself more toxic.
Right. Perhaps because there are fewer plants in that environment, so that
I don't actually know, and I don't know if anyone actually does know. I think you'd almost have to speak the language of deadly nightshade to talk to it to find out why it does it. If you see what I mean. We can only assume. We can only make assumptions, and just because there's a correlation doesn't mean there's causation, right? So we can say, okay, in these kinds of environments it gets more toxic, and maybe in those kinds of environments there's a higher prevalence of insects that are going to become sap suckers or whatever it is, whatever it is that's damaging that plant. But we don't really know, do we?
I was just thinking that, in an arid environment, it's less lush, so there's less food to go around, and
so good thought. So
that the predatory insects, they would do a lot more damage to a single plant simply because there's fewer of them. But
it could easily be that. That's exactly the kind of feedback thing that causes these changes to happen.
Yeah.
We need to be mindful of that because we're changing our own environment, and that environment is the environment we share with the plants and all of the other, natural, normal beings out there. And we are changing those subtle feedback loops in ways that we don't even understand the outcomes of the things that we're doing.
Well, I think there's a problem. I just stumbled across a passage this week in a book on a completely different subject. It's on sort of neurophysiology, really, and how that relates to our experience of life and our psychology.
Mm-hmm.
But as sort of part of the foundational stuff, because this is quite a technical book, it's hard going, I have to say, but there's some basic stuff laying a foundation around homeostasis. That was it.
Yeah.
I lost the word for a moment there.
Yeah.
And of course, that's all about sensitive signaling, which is a feedback that then causes an adjustment to the internal state through the physiology of the organism. But it suddenly hit me while I was reading and rereading this. I mean, it's a fairly straightforward explanation, but I was just trying to make sure I grasp what the basic principles were.
Yeah.
I thought, well, hang on a minute. So ecology then also has this. I mean, I'm sure it's standard thing to sort of talk about this, or I don't know if it is or not. But it just struck me that, well, okay, we've got homeostasis also in this ecological context, which is whether or not people use that term, but like the feedback mechanisms also must have the same kind of reliably sensitive ways of picking up on those signals and responding to them in order to make an adjustment to keep that kind of balance within the ecology. And so, because this is something that just seems to keep coming up, that one of the things we're doing by opting out of vital contact with living systems by our mechanized society, by the fact we don't eat food from here, and et cetera, all the many, many ways, even like shoes on our feet so we don't feel the ground, all of these kind of things that you could see it both as metaphors and concrete examples of how we are not in vital contact, therefore we can't feel.
Yeah.
If I have a callous skin, I can't feel. And if I've got rubber boots on my feet, I can't. And if I've got an umbrella above my head, I can't feel the rain. All these different things. But it's just so many different points at which we are now isolated from that vital contact. So therefore, this homeostasis is not able to function because so far as we are a part in this bigger organism of the ecology of the places that we are, and yet we are not able to hear. The feedback is going, there's too much, there's not enough, or whatever the feedback is, and we're totally deaf, walking on as if that signal was not happening.
Signal not received. Literally. On a microbial level, there are loads of examples of this, and this directly affects us because obviously some of the people listening may or may not know, but a human body has about 30 trillion human cells in it, okay, roughly. We also have approximately 32 trillion bacterial cells on board, and we have around about 10% of that number. We have about 3 trillion fungal cells on board, okay, and 90 trillion active virus particles inside us, okay? That's what the human organism looks like. So we're completely outnumbered, and I haven't even mentioned the parasites and primitive organisms called Archaea. One of the first evolutionary forms that happened. These are the kinds of things that live near deep sea vents in sulfur-rich, low oxygen environments. We've got those too in our bodies, okay? So we're hugely outnumbered by many other forms of life, and the human being, like, we're less than 50%, way less than 50% human cells. Most of this community, over 90% of it, lives in our gut, where it weighs about the same as it weighs about 5 pounds. Okay, 5 pounds of life that is essentially non-human in a way, if you want to define it that way. And because fungus cells are really big and bulky, 50% of the volume of that is fungus. So there's about 240 odd grams of living fungus on average per individual walking around inside of us, okay? Now, all of these living creatures interact directly with our nervous system, and they also interact directly with our immune system. And they do so by signaling using compounds called chemokines and cytokines and signaling compounds called interleukins, okay? So they can communicate. We now know they communicate directly with neurons. People used to think, is there any kind of feedback loop between the inhabitants of the microbiome and the nervous system? It turns out there's actually a direct feedback mechanism, okay, for example. And, our paradigm is shifting. So we used to talk about well, we used to think about the nervous system, the central control thing being in the brain, and the rest of it was just a bunch of wires really that went out into the rest of the body. Now we talk about the gut-brain axis. And I think pretty soon we're going to be really embracing the concept that the brain actually occupies the whole body space. Okay, just because we've got this grey matter floating around like a blancmange in our skull, the actual nervous system as a whole is far more important than separating out one part of it and seeing it as a separate organ. So the microbes that live in our gut can directly signal to neurons that are part of the whole nervous system, and they have direct effects on mood, for example, on blood chemistry, on the endocrine system, on all of the organs that produce hormones and regulate our body, our homeostasis. They have a direct effect. And the gut is also the front line of the immune system in one way. The skin is also the front line, but there are immune cells lining the gut and also lining our skin that actually capture proteins and carbohydrates from the cell walls of things that might otherwise infect us, and they go inwards and report to the T cells and the B cells and trigger an immune response. But people have forgotten something really fundamental, in my opinion, which is that the immune system's job is not just to keep out harmful stuff, because keeping out harmful stuff will not keep us alive. Letting in good stuff keeps us alive. Its job is to let in good stuff. Keeping out harm is part of that process. So the immune system is, when it comes into contact with our food, what it's doing is it's actually sampling that. It's bringing back samples of that material into the immune complex to try and understand whether they're safe or not. And of course, we have things like memory T cells in there that sort of are like a catalogue of responses against things that were harmful. So there are comparisons that get made between these fragments of molecules from our food and our environment that get brought in all day long, all night long. Our bodies are sensing whether aspects of our environment are harmful or helpful, and its job is to let helpful things in order to sustain us. So it's kind of a flip, way of flipping over really the interpretation of the immune system. It's not all about the guards at the gate keeping out bad guys. It's actually all about a mechanism to let lots of good things in to sustain us.
Well,
can I just finish on that?
Yeah, go on.
It's okay. So we're going back to feedback mechanisms, right? So there's a guy called Professor Jeff Leach, who was part of the human microbiome project and the American Gut Project from the University of California, San Diego, I think. And they took a team over to work with the Hadza bush people in Africa. And they made some really important discoveries. They discovered that this huge community that lives within us was much more diverse in species among the bush people than it was in Americans and Western Europeans. Vastly more diverse. And they found microbes in there that enabled the Hadza bush people to, for example, browse all day long on plants that were rich in oxalic acid. Okay. And without causing any inflammation or harm to the gut or the urinary tract, because they have a group of organisms called Oxalobacter on board, which actually breaks down oxalic acid and turns it into food, turns it into nutrition in our gut, okay? Whereas we lack, generally, with our diet not rich in oxalic acid-rich foods, we also lack Oxalobacter to digest them. And they actually discovered also that some of the microbes, including, I think, one group of Oxalobacter that live inside the human gut in this hunter-gatherer population, are, as far as we know, not found anywhere else on Earth except in the guts of hunter-gatherer humans. So by stopping that behaviour, which of course in Western Europe we stopped that behaviour en masse really quite a long time ago, by stopping that behaviour, we stopped putting the food in for a group of microorganisms that only exists inside humans. We are its biological niche. So we're facing the extinction on planet Earth of droves of species of microorganisms that should be living inside the human gut. and they only exist inside the human, and I mean the human gut, not even gut of other animals. We're talking species specific as a niche, okay? Niche, whatever you want to call it. So we're talking about the global extinction that's coming, everyone's talking about that, and we're looking at insect decline, and we're now currently looking at a bit of human decline going on, which is waking a lot of people up. Scary stuff. But this decline in microorganisms has been going on for a really long time. And when we moved away from being hunter-gatherers towards being farmers, and then from being farmers towards people who basically eat processed food in packets that's been filled with mold inhibitors, preservatives, all kinds of things that kill off microbes. Okay. Not to mention the fact that the food itself has probably been nuked, in the UK. We're just not feeding the diverse group of microorganisms that we once had. And they are literally dying out. But each of those microorganisms offers us a set of functionality. In our gut, it's like the members of a society. It's like the way that all of the animals in a rainforest actually offer some function to the ecosystem, without which the ecosystem is less robust. And if you take enough functions away, it starts to fall apart. It's the same with the microbes that live within us. Those communities are, generally speaking, beneficial, and everything when it dies feeds something else. So the fungus, when it dies, feeds a group of microbes called bacteroides, for example, that then excrete anti-inflammatory short-chain fatty acids into our bowel and reduce bowel inflammation. And then that goes through the bowel wall into the bloodstream, and they modulate in the reduction of inflammation in the whole body. Those kinds of beneficial relationships based on signaling start to die out as the microbes die out, right? So the HUDs of people have got a really robust gastroenteric microbiome full of all of these organisms. Ours is much weaker because it has a lower diversity. It can offer less useful functions to us. And if you go back to the idea of a rainforest, if you start taking out enough different systems, not only does the system start to break down, but it starts to break down in really big, complicated ways. Whole chains of feedback are broken. When the fungal population gets reduced, the clouds of fungal spores above the forest are reduced. So the rainfall is reduced because that seeds rain. So the climate changes. So you get bigger, much more macro effects. Once you take out enough members of the community, and then the remaining members, because they've lost some of their food sources, or because the chemistry of the substrate has now changed, start competing. They start moving from one area of tissue where they lived to a different part of tissue. Or they start crossing boundaries into bodily organs and using them as food, and they become pathogens. They become toxic to us when before they were our helpers that provided ecosystem functions. So right the way down to the micro, the same principle holds, exactly the same principle you were talking about. Out the, ecological homeostasis, I don't know what the word is for it, but it's like about robustness that is created by diversity, but it's not random diversity.
Yeah.
Everything fits into a unique place that offers unique functions, ecosystem resources to everything else. And when you remove something from the system, you remove those resources, and the whole thing starts to become really, really unstable. And you get this oscillation of stability.
I think it's really interesting because what I was flagging up is our inability to hear and therefore to respond to feedback. But it's almost like the picture that you're painting there is that there comes a point where these signals falling on deaf ears means that you wake up one morning and you think, oh my God, what have I been? I need to listen. You take your ear mufflers off and you scrape your callous skin off so you can feel again, and you take the scales off your eyes, and there's nobody there.
Yeah.
There are no signals anymore. It's too late. And I was just thinking your thing about the skin. I remember hearing you talk a while back, and you introduced me to this donut idea, which I've repeated many, many times since, because it's such a helpful thing to realize just how much skin we actually have. So you're describing these things basically on the frontier between the inside of us and the outside of us. But I'll just say for everybody, the donut idea is that our skin actually goes inside our mouths, down through our esophagus, into our digestive tract, and eventually comes out the other end with our anus. But the same is true of our lungs. It's actually true, in fact, of our ears. There's all kinds of skin that turns in, so that there's this surface of ourselves, which is a kind of frontier between the inside and the outside. So it's really interesting that you're talking about the immune system and all of these other organisms who are both positive and negative gatekeepers. For me, one of the central things about life is the presence of these semi-permeable membranes that have this possibility of things going in and out. But when the system's working, we have a very efficient and highly tuned, sensitive method of making sure the right amount of something comes in and other things don't come in, and then at a certain stage what needs to come out comes out, like e.g. with breathing and excretion and so on. But the picture that you're painting is very profound, because it's talking about the complexity of our basically partnership with many, many, many other species. So that there's the sensitivity of that, what's coming in and what's going out being just right, as opposed to a machine where there's just a wall. Yeah, that's how we're going to deal with it. We're just going to put this impenetrable barrier, because it's actually so crude. We think a machine is such a sophisticated thing, but it's actually unbelievably blunt as an instrument compared to this sort of softness that we have with organic tissues that don't need to be rock solid. They don't need to be impermeable because they've got so many mates. Basically, this is the thing. We have these friendships with other species and other beings that we don't necessarily consciously listen to. But the other thing I was going to just pick up on is you saying about the brain, because what I've been picking up, the book I was referring to is all about the vagus nerve and so on. And one of the things that they've set straight in discussing the vagus nerve is that the vagus nerve is able to communicate from all of our organs and so on to the brain, but also the brain is a command center in a sense of giving instructions to the various organs. But the fact is, it's 80% that is received from the body going to the brain, and only 20%. So the signaling is 80% going to the brain, feedback, and only 20% is coming down from the brain through the vagus to the gut, the heart, and etc., saying, oh, do this, do that. Yeah. But even when you think about it, all of that 20% that's coming down is merely implementing the information that everything else has just fed to it in terms of the 80%.
That's right. So, making it more specific to the body that it's got to manage.
Right. Yeah, the body that it is now. So it's it is this sort of finely tuned homeostasis. But yeah,
that's what is truly, truly amazing. It's absolutely amazing. And then when we look at the plant kingdom, well, let's go back to foraging again. Okay, so there's lots and lots of feedback mechanisms between the organism that eats the plant and the plant itself. There's lots and lots of different subtle things going on there. On one level, on a neurological level, on a neurochemistry level, when we forage, it stimulates the release of dopamine in the brain. Okay, so dopamine is a wonderful thing. Dopamine makes us feel more relaxed. It makes us feel calmer, but also in some way excited, because it actually drives us to repeat the behavior, whatever it is that we're doing that stimulates more dopamine release. And it's conjectured that the reason for dopamine release is actually because it compels an organism to carry on doing things that support life. Okay, so prior to the days of people manufacturing synthetic chemicals to get high on, or prior to the days of supermarkets where people will literally walk around selecting things from the aisles in brightly coloured packages, which also stimulates dopamine release. Okay, prior to that, it was actually all connected to the behaviour of gathering food and also procreation. You know, having sex causes dopamine release too, which means that the species carries on. When people go out foraging, they find food, they bring it back to the community. There is a kind of a biochemically based sense of well-being that comes from foraging through this dopamine release, okay, that keeps us doing it, keeps us wanting to do it. It also makes us feel good inside because we're actually connecting with the hardwired biochemistry that we have evolved with over countless millions of years before we were even human beings at all. So that is going on, and it's not that effect. It's a really powerful effect. Even honeybees produce dopamine in their tiny bee brains when they're out foraging on flowers. Okay, it's what keeps them doing it, and that's not to be underestimated. And that's just one of the subtle effects. But then, if you go down to the level of looking at the various different organisms that partner with the plants, we start opening up this whole world of what, in a way, I think is the plant's microbiome, its connection with fungi, and also with helper bacteria that help the fungi to do their job. And, you know, there's a lot coming out about this at the moment. I know recently the BBC produced a wonderful animation that went pretty viral, I think, on social media about the Wood Wide Web and the connections between tree roots. And it was based on wonderful work by Suzanne Simard that was published quite recently, just, 3 or 4 years ago, after 30 years of her work, where she discovered that not only do trees talk to each other, but it's far more sophisticated than that. And that growing mature trees actually, on a nice sunny day, will feed 80% of the carbohydrates that they make. So, you know, they're all there photosynthesizing, gathering sunlight and carbon dioxide and manufacturing sugars and carbs. And 80% of those carbs are fed directly through the root system, through fungal mycelial strands in the soil to the other trees.
Yeah.
Okay. And because fungus itself builds its own network of mycelium strands, which are basically long tubular cells, it builds them out of carbohydrates, so the fungus gets to benefit. But fungal cells produce water, so when the trees are struck by drought, because they're connected to loads more fungus mycelium, the fungus mycelium is able to feed water directly into the tree roots. And they also act as a kind of a banking system where, you know, if there's too much, not too much, but an excess of food being made in one part of the forest, they're able to redistribute it to the trees that aren't getting enough sunlight so that they can produce enough carbohydrates of their own. And they're also able to transmit electrical signals through the mycelium. There's this 7 hertz, you know, something that looks very, very much like a human nerve action impulse if you connect it to an oscilloscope. And it's being done now, you know, so the whole fungal mycelium network is connecting electrically to the trees, and it's able to signal to the root systems of the trees, but also it's able to pass soluble compounds. So when the fungus is there out in the forest, breaking down dead squirrels and dead bacteria and dead branches, the soluble end results of that, some of those are plant nutrients, nitrates, phosphates, you know, potassium, salts, and all the minor nutrients, copper, manganese, and zinc, and all the rest of it. And they get fed in soluble form through the tubular fungus mycelium back into the tree roots. But one of the things that she found that was truly shocking was that in some way that we as yet don't understand, that mature trees are able to specify that their excessive nutrients get fed to their own genetic offspring. And then when there's an excess that even they don't need, that gets fed to members of the same species. And then when there's an excess that they don't need, the rest gets fed to the other trees and other plants, obviously, because trees are plants, that are connected to the same fungus mycelium mats within the soil. Okay, so there's this hugely complex system with masses and masses of biofeedback mechanisms going on all the way through it. that keeps the whole thing robust and stable as a whole. Because if something affects it, whether it's climatic, whether it's drought, whether it's a pest that comes from one direction and starts attacking a tree, which is then able to biochemically signal through the mycelium to the other trees, which means that they can then toughen up their cell walls or produce more bitter sap or whatever it is, this huge interconnectedness, which involves lots of other species, not just the trees themselves, increases the robustness of the system. When you isolate the trees out and remove the connections and the microorganisms, including the fungi, die out, suddenly the trees are vulnerable, okay? They have to fend for themselves, literally. They can't spread their excess food to their offspring or others species or share it back into the nutrient cycle, so the amount of nutrients available is vastly diminished. They can't warn each other of pests and predators. They're not getting the drought protection that is offered to them by fungus mycelium. So let's drill this right the way down to the level of plants that we forage from. So, we do forage from trees quite a lot, but even right the way down to the humble plantain, which is one of my favorite food plants, because in the summer it offers me leafy salad. If I, put little stacks of them together and chop them up across the veins, I put them into salads with other leaf plants. And the unopened flower buds of the ribwort and the greater plantain, before they even sort of telescope out into a long structure, are really nice. They're just nutty and chewy and really, really tasty to pick straight from the earth. And then they go through this little phase when the flower petals form, these little tiny, creamy, white-coloured petals, and the whole thing becomes a bit cardboardy and papery and not particularly pleasant. And then the seeds ripen after that, and the seed heads are they're rich in omega oils, they're delicious, they're nutty, and the whole seed heads, can be stir-fried, maybe with a bit of sesame oil or something like that, and they're delicious. So plantain's a wonderful plant for food, but if you eat plantain leaves from a place where the soil has not been messed around with too much, so if you take plantain leaves not from somebody's lawn that's had loads of weed and feed and fertilizer put in and, something like that sort of setting, but if you take it from mature pasture land that's really only been grazed for hundreds of years, or you take it from a hay meadow, it tastes different. It tastes of mushrooms. There's a mushroom flavour, particularly in the ribwort plantain, stronger in the leaf. And I'm always pointing this out to people on foraging walks, and they look at me like, oh, yeah. And then they chew it and they go, oh, my God, it tastes like raw mushrooms. Okay. Now, something I found out is that the plantains, the Plantago species, in general, have an even higher level of mycorrhizal connection to soil fungi, mycelium connections to different species of soil fungi, than do many other plants. They're incredibly connected to the fungal ecosystems. And what I believe is that there is literally a fungal flavor because there's more fungus present and more fungal derived compounds present in those plants. You can actually taste, in a way, you're tasting the richness of the soil itself. And then also plants contain endophytic fungi. So they have single-celled fungi that live within the spaces between the plant cells. And there can be 100 or 200 species in a single plant.
Yeah.
Okay? And these plants appear to be incredibly rich in endophytic fungi. Now, to the plants themselves, they're providing ecosystem functions. They're strengthening the plant's immune system and its resilience, and also connecting it to all the other plantains and all the other plants, and mainlining it into minerals that are present in the soil that it really couldn't take up at the same level without the fungus. But the presence of those fungal cells and fungal compounds is also modulating our immune systems. It's also strengthening our immune systems too. So we become part of that system once we plug into it by eating the plant, by ingesting it. We're becoming part of that system. And I think that's remarkable. I think the implications of that are massive. Back to you, Marks. I've waffled on a bit there.
No, that's beautiful. The plantain is really, really interesting. And I've got a couple of little stories about that. One is I do use it for little cuts and and wounds and so on.
Mm.
And to that end, I chopped a load up one time. I thought, well, I'll just have it as a ready thing and see if it lasts a few days, just in case we need it again. I'll chop a bit more than I need. And so I put all of this very finely chopped plantain into a small jar and just put the lid on. The thing is, it was still without any sign of mold or off notes, because I tasted it. A good year later, it was incredible. So what we basically ended up with was lacto fermented ribwort plantain, very sour, no salt added, no anything else added, and I think it's probably the most stable ferment that I've ever done with.
It's amazing.
With no airlock or anything like that to make sure that it was anaerobic. It was just completely stable. I think at that point it was probably not that much good for healing and so on. I don't know how it would have changed chemically and a sort of high lactic acid content, but still that was quite a lesson for me that here's a plant that has got so much. Well, I don't know if it's the fungi or what's going on, but it's steering, it's making everything back off that would turn it moldy or off or something like that.
Yeah. Well, I think you're, conjecturally, I would say you're probably right, and that a lot of fungal organisms produce bactericidal compounds so that they themselves are not predated upon by harmful bacteria in the first place. So, a lot of the more dodgy pathogenic bacteria that you wouldn't want to eat would be suppressed quite actively by the presence of many fungi. For the same reasons, because they digest their cells as well. Okay, so what you're saying is probably spot on, but also the healing effects of something are not always about the chemicals in it, but they're often modulated by the gut. So when you swallow it, it's the kinds of things that the gut microbes can break it down into.
Right. Yeah.
Biochemistry that has the healing properties. And so it's not always about the chemistry of the plant in the strictest sense. It's a virtuous chain of things consuming other things, and creating metabolites, excreting byproducts that then have some other effect or feed something else. And so it was still very medicinally active in many ways. May have changed it a bit.
Yeah, I mean, I just thought, well, I know the fresh stuff works, so I'm not going to muck about and put that on as an experiment. I'm going to put the fresh stuff on a cut rather than that. But yeah, I mean, you say about the chain. I mean, to me, it sounds like things unfolding. Like the presence of the plant, the presence of the bacteria, and then there's this interaction whereby these potentials unfold.
Yeah,
a kind of
It puts me in mind of medieval alchemical texts.
Right.
Hugely long, very poetic language that they use, describing the relationships between all of the different processes that they put plant materials through. And maybe it's not a literal. Maybe it's more of a metaphor, but it's extremely complex, and we don't understand often the end result. Our understanding of these things is still very, very blunt indeed. Actually. Yeah. I've got a lovely little anecdote about the plantain, though. I was teaching foraging. I did a foraging walk at a festival a few years ago. I'll give it a plug. I don't know if it's still going. It was the Workhouse Festival up in Wales, where a place called Llanfwrthlyn, where a group of people have taken over an old Victorian workhouse, which is partly derelict, and it's got huge grounds around it and some land that goes down to a river and some woods. And it's like a big community. So they've got craft workshops there, people selling stuff that they make. There are also people living there, and people go to, they do yoga workshops and retreats and all sorts of stuff. And they have a festival there once a year to fund it of a couple of thousand people. And I went to this festival. I got invited to be the foraging person. And we were out on a walk with a guy called Rob. I still remember his cheeky face right now, because he's one of these characters, unforgettable characters, larger than life. And we're walking along, and he goes, "Excuse me, I have a problem." And I said, "What's that?" He said, "Well, I've just been bitten by a horsefly." He said, but I'm really allergic to horsefly bites, and I haven't brought my EpiPen with me, and I might be struggling to breathe in sort of 20 minutes or so. He said, I'm really scared, and I said, right, okay, we need to get back to the camp so you can contact people, you can get your EpiPen. So we turned around, but just at that moment, I looked down, and literally in between his pair of Dr. Martens was a plantain plant right between his feet. And it's funny how this happens, So I said, look, this is an antihistamine. This plant, really? Yeah, I said, yeah, this plant is an antihistamine. It's quite a good one too. So we picked the ribwort plantain between his feet, and I got him to chew it all up and suck down as much of the juice as possible, and then rub the green chewed up material on the bite area as well. And then we set off about walking calmly, without panicking, back to the festival camp. And about 10 minutes later, we were almost back. And he said, well, by now I'd be itching all over. And, I'd be starting to feel really strange. And maybe I'd start to pant. And he said, but there's nothing going on. There's absolutely nothing going on. And then somebody who was in the group, this girl turned to him and she said, well, if you can't see where the bite was, it's on your neck. It was actually his neck. She said, but it's gone. You can't see it. It's complete, because it was coming up red, at the point, very quick, coming up like a red, swollen area, inflamed area. And by this time, 10 minutes had passed and there was no visible sign of where it was. And, I kept checking in with him. He had his EpiPen he didn't use it back at the camp, and he didn't need it. And it turned out that he was the guy selling coffee at the festival. He had the caravan that was the coffee, real coffee stall. And so we had free coffee all weekend, which was also quite a nice little spin-off. So thanks, Plantain.
Yeah, brilliant. Got you some free coffee.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, I've got a less spectacular story, but just to do with putting plantain on a wound. Because I did something really stupid last week. I was out on the salt marsh with my kids, and I let them play in the mud. It's quite a wild space, but still, I should have known better. And guess what's happened? They're barefoot in the mud, and I don't know what, but so there's some broken glass or something metal in that mud. So don't let your kids play barefoot in the mud, folks. It's not worth it. No. And I'm walking back to the car because we're taken back to left the kids playing, and they start screaming. I have to run back, pick him up, and there's blood pouring out of his foot. Yeah.
Oh, best.
Where I took his sock off, tied it tight, stopped the bleeding, and then when we get back properly on the shore and we're walking along, there's ribwort plantain everywhere. So I said, we're going to stop now. We're going to put the plantain on top of that wound and get you home. So we got him home, cleaned it up. And I've got an excellent spice grinder. It's like a really heavyweight thing, really heavy, so you don't even have to put much pressure. It does like a pestle and mortar with teeth. It really grinds up the thing. And so I've got lots of plantain just ground to pulp, and we cleaned the wound, bandaged it up nicely with just a great big load of ground up plantain, and we just kept repeating that. I actually put a bit of wound wort in there the second day. But basically, plantain and wound wort, no other kind of. We didn't take it in a hospital. It was a deep cut.
Yeah.
And there's been not a trace of any kind of infection or pus or anything like that. It's healing up now. I think he may have a slight green tattoo in the end.
Yeah.
I don't know. It's coming off, but I have a feeling he might have a little green streak on his foot from where this plant dye has ended up.
It'll probably fade eventually.
Yeah.
I did a really similar thing with my hand. I gashed it open with a bill hook. I was out coppicing out in some hazel coppice a few years back, because in previous jobs I've done a lot of woodland management work, and I was out on my own, stupidly probably, working with nobody else present. I had a really sharp bill hook, and I missed. I missed. I caught my hand, gashed right the way across the kind of pad at the base of my thumb, that big sort of fleshy pad. In the palm of my hand, and it gaped open. Really hard place to close up. There was nobody present. I didn't know what to do. And I saw yarrow growing.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
Which yarrow, it's got this amazing. You probably know this, Miles, but for the benefit of those listening, one of the old names of yarrow is archer's balm. It was used in battlefields to close and to sterilize and to purge wounds from arrows and spears. Okay, so there I am with this yarrow, and I'm like, okay, this is the best possible opportunity to give this one a whirl. So I picked some lovely fresh yarrow leaves. Again, spit poulticed, so I chewed up the yarrow leaves to make a nice green gloopy mush, because that's all I had. And I packed the wound with it and then bandaged it over with my bandana, bandaged around my hand. Okay, and it healed with the yarrow inside it.
Yeah.
I had a green streak across my palm for a few weeks. There was no infection at all. It healed incredibly rapidly. And what yarrow does is it causes the wound to purge. So it causes it to pump a little bit of capillary blood for about 30 seconds. It flushes and pushes out anything that might have been heading inwards. And then the sort of styptic effect closes it and stops it bleeding.
Right. Yeah.
A wound with an irregular edge, actually, but this was quite a clean wound, really. It was just very deep. So I packed the yarrow, the chewed up, spat upon yarrow into the wound, bandaged it up, and after 2 or 3 days, I unwound the bandage and had a good old look at it. It was fully closed, fully granulated, healed over, just with a green streak. The healing was so fast, it's left no scar. And after a few weeks, the green completely disappeared. And that was a really deep wound. By rights, it would have been, definitely at least half a dozen stitches. It had nothing. So there you go. These plants we deal with, they're really, really powerful beings, actually.
They're powerful, and yet they're so near and available. It just never ceases. It was right there when I needed it. Your yarrow was right there when you needed it. That plantain was between that guy's feet. It's like,
yeah.
I can't really move away from the recurring thought of just how friendly all this stuff is.
Yeah.
It's right there with us, and it's beckoning us to just receive the benefit, that's there. It makes you feel better, really, in terms of like all the kind of threat and looming disaster and so on. There's still a bunch of friendliness that is, tapping us on the shoulder, I feel.
Nature is one big organism, and all the while, this back to this homeostasis, but in the whole of nature kind of idea that tabled earlier on. When there's sufficient diversity for everything to offer up its unique benefits to the system, everything just rubs along nicely. And it's true. There are predators, there are prey relationships. Those are also part of the system, and nothing else. Even fungus mycelium, which is more or less immortal, is not indestructible. But ultimately, the system is one of benefit and beneficial relationships when you take it as a whole.
Yeah.
So if we start reducing that diversity and all the benefits that get offered, the things fall into a competitive status with each other and start to break down. I think we need to learn that lesson powerfully in our own society. And we need to mimic nature if we want to be successful, not seek to dominate it, or not seek to distill the complexity of these signaling relationships in nature down to very small, mechanical, blunt relationships.
Yeah.
Because that is going to lead to our demise and the demise of the ecosystem. We need to be part of nature as we truly are if we want to truly succeed.
It's so funny. I was just thinking, where did this come from? There was I think it was a Simpsons thing where there's some hippie doing something or other, and then somebody else comes along who's clearly on the wrong track, and the hippie says to him, "Simplify, man, simplify." I was thinking, no, actually, that's completely the wrong advice.
The opposite.
Complexify, man.
Yeah.
And
complexity, because it's so complex, but it opens our minds even to think about it, even to ponder it. Opens our hearts and our minds to that complexity. It makes us realize, I think, it makes me realize just what a gift this life is, just what an incredible opportunity.
How we take our place in that is also quite sweet and beneficial when you realize, well, look, in order to stand to benefit, in order to stand in this place where the good stuff that's here is actually available to me rather than just being over there, but I can't reach it, or I don't know how, or in some way, this potential benefit is eluding me.
Yeah.
That's because we've just stepped out, and it turns out that stepping out is by making the mistake of thinking that the key to unlocking the benefits is to be in control.
Yeah.
Whereas actually the key to unlocking the benefits is to surrender to the fact that you cannot be in control. All you can do is find your niche, find the particular bit in all of this that you are.
Yes.
That's how it unfolds, which kind of different approach, but
I would say to people, on this subject, I say that life's a journey of discovery, but it's about discovering what you're for.
What you're for, yeah.
It's about finding out what you're for. That's it.
Yeah. So that brings us back to the Robin Harper chat before. We were looking out of Robin's window, so I was just jamming with the phrase point of view. So now we can see your point of view. From here you see this.
Mm-hmm.
But then I start to play with the words and say, what's the point of view? What is the point of view? What are you for? Yeah.
I can hear the bee. We've got beehives out in the garden. I can actually, I can hear a low humming, which is a good sign because they're, it's been a little bit chilly at nights and stuff. So we're only seeing a few bees emerging at peak times of the day when there's a lot of heat. But they've all come through the winter quite well. And if there are any beekeepers out there listening, is it okay, Miles, if I quickly share a couple of observations that I have about the bees?
Wonderful.
Because the bees are a really important part of our garden. We grow our own medicinal herbs and our own vegetables, but also we see our garden as a little island of diversity that, helps along the diversity of the whole neighborhood, really, because we're surrounded by agricultural land and some of that land gets hit quite hard at times. And the bees used to die out quite a bit at the end of winter. We'd find you'd lose a colony or a couple of colonies, and they'd struggle. They had to requeen themselves, or maybe they just die out altogether. And I was doing the thing that we're all taught to do. The orthodox thinking is that our bees are suffering badly from varroa mite infection, which is a type of mite that came, I think, from the Middle East, and it carries a viral infection with it. And the viral infection causes deformed bees and weak bees. So the mites tend to latch onto the larvae of bees, particularly drone bees, and it basically sucks their blood out. Okay, but it also transfers a virus into the bee colony. And you end up with bees with deformed wings, and they're undersized, and they're just not very good. And it weakens the colonies. But the advice generally is you should treat the bees each year, a couple of times a year, with substances, either thymol, which is an alcohol substance derived from the thyme plant, but it's in a very strong, crystallized, concentrated form that's really quite toxic. And it's toxic to the human nervous system and also to the bee nervous system. Or things like oxalic acid, actually, this, again, a naturally occurring substance, but in a still concentrated, purified form that's very irritating to the bees and makes them clean the mites off. So these are the kind of things that most beekeepers are doing. And I started noticing that after I treated the bees in the autumn, they were really unhappy. They just seemed really, really distressed. And no matter what anyone says, I put this down to the chemical treatments, because they are chemical treatments, even if they're plant-derived, and decided I was going to just try and not treat them. And what I discovered, and this is now nearly 6 years ago, okay, what I discovered was that the bees went through the winter with a larger colony of bees, and in the spring, when I checked the varroa count, the number of mites in the colony was, because you have this floor that you slide out and the dead mites drop to the bottom, the number of mites was no different from not treating to when I was treating. Actually, after a little period of time had elapsed, the number of mites was more or less the same, and it seemed to be quite stable and not getting worse and not getting better. But what I wasn't getting was so many deformed bees, okay? And my colonies, since 6 years ago, when I completely stopped all forms of chemical treatment, and I did one other thing, which was that I always left them enough of their own honey to get through the winter without requiring any sugar syrup to be put on as feed. So they were always using their own honey through the winter. Those two things, since I did those two things, I've not lost a single colony in 6 years. Whereas every winter before that, I would treat for varroa. And also, you take off some honey, and in the middle of winter, or not in the middle of winter, but probably in the early spring, that you'd find they were running out of food and put sugar syrup on to get them through. Yeah. Those were the times when we were losing bees. So I now feel that this need to treat the varroa is wrong. It's about managing the strength of the colony by giving them their own honey, the things that they need, that they've manufactured, full of these lovely, complex phytonutrients that they're getting from the plants. That's what's going to get them through, not chemical synthetic plant derivatives that are actually quite strong acidic chemicals, in the case of oxalic acid, for example. But actually it's about them getting their own herbal medicine from their own honey, which is what they're made for. And Paul Stamets over in America has been doing some work with mushrooms and bees. He's now coming up with commercially available products, but initially it was all about a childhood memory that he had of seeing bees drinking the liquid dew forming on mushroom fruit bodies, and particularly Ganodermas, I think. So things like in this country we've got a lot of Ganoderma australe, the southern bracket, and Ganoderma applanatum, the artist bracket, particularly growing on beech trees. So I thought, hey, we'll give this a go. And our bees have got a little pond. It's an old Belfast sink with gravel in it and water in it, and a little solar pump. We need to get a new pump because it's just bust. And what I do is each year I float a Ganoderma fruit body, a conch, the hard woody fruit body of the artist bracket. I just float one in the bee pond. And the bees, it soaks up the moisture, and the sponge-like pore surface underneath where the spores are made becomes like a sponge. And as the mushroom slowly decomposes, the bees crawl over the surface and they drink the moisture out of that sponge. Okay? And what Paul Stamets found was that the bees that were feeding on Ganodermas, you could detect Ganoderma mycelium in the bee colonies.
Wow.
He conjectured that because of its antibacterial properties and antiviral properties and all the rest of it, that it's the bee's immune system as a colony. So maybe that's got something to do with why we've had 6 years of not losing bee colonies as well. So to the beekeepers listening, I reckon it's really important to feed them their own honey in the winter. And I think stop treating for varroa mites. It's really counterproductive because it weakens the bee colonies and makes them sick. Over winter in our climate, where things are quite tough for them in the winter, if they're already weakened in the autumn by one of these treatments. So there you go. I'd like to offer that out to the world.
That's brilliant. Well, it's lovely to hear that, and it also ties in neatly because I wanted to pick up on something you were talking about earlier with bees and us, with that thought about the dopamine system. Well, I was really interested to hear that because I'm very conscious of how dopamine is problematic around addictive behaviors, and the it's the kind of fuel of modern life, isn't it? That people are being trapped into one kind of reward-seeking behavior after another.
Yes.
And I kind of had a mental note to self, which I haven't got around to doing, which is let's look at what the good press is about dopamine, because clearly this is integral to our neurochemistry and our our mental, emotional, motivational functioning.
Yeah.
So you've just kind of done that for me because I haven't got around to doing it. Just to see that, like, this is actually really good stuff. That's I'm tapping into dopamine when I get excited to find a morel, or when I've found my Japanese knotweed patch is starting to produce again, in spite of the fact the bastards poisoned it 3 years ago.
Yeah.
Got some. It's recovering. Things like that. It hadn't occurred to me that was my reward centers firing with dopamine, and that's what
True.
keeps me going.
Yeah.
In that kind of context.
So addiction, can I just say?
Yeah.
In that context that you've just described, addiction is a positive behavioral trait that has been subverted.
Yeah.
Okay?
Yeah.
We are supposed to be addicted to finding food. Yeah? That's what keeps us alive and makes us strong. And it is foraging specifically. So if you ask someone to go and pick you some knotweed, you don't get the dopamine release that you get when you actually put your hands around the stem and cut the stem or whatever it is you do. That's when you get your dopamine release. It's that interaction. Okay? Now, I'm going to just throw, we're going to look at the demon in the closet for a second, I think. So there is another kind of foraging behavior that goes on, and I think it's the symptom of the way this positive behavior has been twisted and perverted, really, in our society, and that is shopping. Okay, people get addicted to shopping, and when they're out there, browsing the shelves or looking at the clothes on the rack, or even shopping on Amazon, and I'm as guilty as anybody. What they're doing is sorting through lots of things, and in a way, they're kind of mentally firing up a lot of the same neural networks that they're using when they're foraging in the undergrowth. Okay, and it does stimulate dopamine release, and it is addictive. But what we've done is replaced nature's, I don't want to say nature's supermarket, because to be a forager, you mustn't just be a consumer. You have to be a part of the system. But in a way, we've replaced nature's supermarket, to use a term I don't like, with a different kind of supermarket, which then means that we have to exchange theoretical token value in order to get the things that sustain life, and do so relatively poorly, because it's not fresh and we're not getting that direct kind of response that we get when we gather it for ourselves. And so I don't know if this is a cynical move or whether it's somebody trying to control us. I'm not looking at it that way. I just want people to draw their own conclusions. Okay. But somehow or other, we've landed ourselves in this hole where we are all controlled. And one of the things that controls us, one of the vectors of that control, is this dopamine response.
Yeah.
So somebody did, I can't remember the name of the experiment or anything else, but it's an absolutely brilliant one. I don't know, maybe you know it. Somebody did an experiment, I believe, with rat communities where, you had these rats that were conditioned into sort of idealized addictive behavior, and then they put them into an area where rats were able to behave as natural rats, had the right kind of habitat and everything else, and was a much more normal situation for them. And the addictive behavior, I believe, was lost.
Yeah. What it was the they were getting their dopamine hit. I think it was cocaine they got them all addicted to. But they were basically getting their dopamine hit from the cocaine because of conditions of social isolation mainly. And,
yes.
and what happened was that they then started getting the dopamine hit from just the bonding with the other rats. Just the social contact was given them the reward. And it's that gave rise to some of the most recent thinking, which I think has got to be spot on, which is basically saying that addiction is symptomatic of a breakdown in your capacity to form bonds and feel good, because that's still neurochemistry. When you gel with someone and bond with them, you got all kinds of stuff rushing through your bloodstream that's making you feel good.
Yeah.
So it's not like that we're not supposed to get high,
We
are getting high, but it happens because of contact.
Yeah.
Whereas what addictive behavior does is it, and it's the same. So what you've done is fill in the gap for me, because like the foraging as contact and the reward system there is happening because of an interaction with the plants and the place, and I haven't quite got that. Whereas I had thought a lot about that rat experiment and thought, well, this is it. We're substituting just the buzz that we get off oxytocin, but I hadn't thought about dopamine, for something. And then the other thing that's to me so prevalent now is shopping, and then surfing the internet. It's terrible, absolutely terrible, because you get a buzz because you found this, buzz because you found that, buzz because, and YouTube just cues them up. and you're staring at these ones that are queuing up while you're watching this one that you're excited you found. I can't handle those drugs. I don't have the internet in my house, and I don't have a smartphone, because to me, I'm still far too susceptible to that shit.
Yeah, I'm really susceptible to it too, and I find it incredibly useful. I do a lot of study online, so it's really difficult to kind of separate myself as much as you have. But I think you're absolutely spot on, and it's something I'm looking at doing too, because I think that's it. I think in this conversation we potentially nailed it. It's not just about the relationship between, like with the rats, it was the social relationship to the other rats. And it didn't stop them being addicted. It just made them addicted to what they were supposed to be addicted to.
Yeah.
Because the addiction is actually a natural impulse that's become subverted, and it's a life-affirming impulse that has been subverted. And
I don't know.
Nature and other beings.
I don't know. I think I've got this phrase I came up with. I haven't actually presented this talk yet, but I've got a title to a talk. It just sounds a bit risky, so I haven't had the guts to do it. But it's from bondage to bonding. That's you see. So those, because they're all linkages. The addictive linkages are bondage.
Yeah.
We are not free, and we're tied to something that isn't actually feeding us. Whereas the bonds are linkages. They're the ties that bind. They're the fabric of life, et cetera, et cetera. And they are feeding us, So, and this is the thing, the machine has got us, like we are now like cyborgs, that big parts of our functionality is connected in these mechanical ways without the sensitivity of the semi-permeable membranes. And this is bad shit. We're in chains. These linkages are chains, whereas the bonds are beautiful connections, like that mycelium under the ground that you described so wonderfully.
Yeah.
It's bonds or bondage, I think.
What you just said is really beautiful. It really is. The primal urge behind what I was trying to say was the primal urge behind the addiction is the thing that's been subverted. Not that addiction is a good thing.
Yeah.
The urge.
Oh no, I know what you're saying. Yeah.
Here's something I can say that, some of the people listening to this are going to go, what the hell is he talking about? But one of the things I studied quite a lot in the past was the tarot. Okay, so we're way off the topic of science and way off foraging here. Okay, but if you want to put it in, do. There are two cards in a tarot deck, in a traditional Rider-Waite tarot deck, the one that you see in all the movies, that used for fortune telling. And the two cards, one is the Lovers, and one is the Devil. And the Devil represents bondage, okay? So you have this devil figure in the middle with chains coming off of it, and you have a man and a woman chained to usually, his feet or whatever it is. And then in the Lover's card, you have a symbol in the middle signifying, or a being signifying love. It could be a cherub or whatever it is. And you have two people, a man and a woman, who represent love. And it's not necessarily representation of love between two people, but it's representing a virtuous connection.
Yeah.
Now, if you superimpose those two cards from the Rider-Waite tarot deck, the outlines of the whole thing, they just match. The one superimposes on the other exactly. And I think there was designed to be a hidden message when that deck was created, which was that the only difference between the devil or bondage and the lovers or bonding was that one was a virtuous relationship and one was a harmful relationship. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Oh, straight over the top of each other. If you put them side by side, it's quite remarkable how similar they are.
Yeah.
And I think that just sums up exactly what you just said. So thank you, because that's just great.
Oh, you're welcome. You're welcome. So the other thing I want to just say, just in connection to dopamine, because if I could say, I wish I could quote the guy, but perhaps we'll put it on the links. I'll look it up and put it on the links for this podcast. But there's a guy that's basically talking a lot about sugar and industrial food, but mainly sugar. And he republished some book from the 80s, which at the time everybody was saying this guy's I can't remember either name, the guy from the 80s or this guy. But anyway, they were basically looking at sugar as this highly destructive thing, this highly addictive thing. And of course, it fits with all of the things we're saying because, sugar is something that occurs in complex foods, or even in the case of honey, it's got these other complex plant compounds, and you just don't get too much of it or whatever. So it's the complexity of life being reduced yet again into one thing when we eat sugar all the time. And this guy's done all of this work around sugar and addictive behavior around food. And he characterized it as a dopamine fueled scenario. Yeah. When people are addicted to terrible food. But he also, he basically had the sort of good guy and a bad guy neurochemically, which is why I was a bit stuck on dopamine being categorically the bad guy, even though I know it's part of us. So there must be the true story, the real dopamine. Please come out and all of that. So, but he was saying it's dopamine and serotonin, and the way he characterized it was, dopamine is this reward-seeking behavior, and if that gets a grip, then what we have is this addictive thing where things are obviously very negative and destructive. But with serotonin, I don't know, perhaps it has a shadow side, but what he drew out with serotonin was that it's all the slow and steady stuff, Mm-hmm. We have serotonin when we just get some physical exercise. Well, obviously, traditionally, nobody did this bizarre behavior of going for a run or going to the gym or any of that stuff, or even yoga. They were just alive in their surroundings, and in order to be alive, you have to be active, and so you got serotonin as a result of the physical activity you had to just get the stuff you needed and do the stuff you needed to do. And then the other one is the relational context, that serotonin's released by in relational contexts, and obviously dopamine is too, as you say, and we can crack on and have dopamine in terms of some of the insights we have in this conversation. I'm sure that it's rewarding that we're going, I see that, and so on, as we're listening and going back and forth. But the slow and steady thing in relationships, where we see people every day and we do the hard work of putting up with people when they're A, boring, B, annoying, C, won't do what we want them to do. we go whatever the EFG and to Z as all of that is, but we just put up with each other and go the distance, and we have that reward of the steady, consistent presence, and so he was just unwinding all that to show the serotonin comes through the slow and steady, non-reward seeking behavior or delayed gratification. That's the other side of that. I
think it's part of the balance, isn't it? So when serotonin levels are higher, people are more able to deal with more complex emotions, and they're better at delaying gratification.
Right.
They're less likely to sort of, just react like that and snap at you, because they'll think about what you've said and maybe think, well, actually, now's not the moment. The presence of serotonin allows more activity to go on in the cerebellum, and it's not quite so focused on the sort of more primitive brainstem and more central areas of the brain. But there's also melatonin to take into account as well, which is the kind of recharge, reset, relax mechanism. And I think there's probably a balance between all of these, that needs to be got right. And I think if any one of them's out of whack, it causes the others to go out of whack as well. But I suspect there are many more factors. It's probably way more complex than we even currently understand.
Well, I guess it's one of the weird things that we even have to think about this. But I guess, they say if it's not broken, don't fix it. Well, it's broken, baby. So we're having to think about it. We're having to think about how could we, what is my particular level of dysfunctionality? What is my particular malaise? And then when we bring these sort of things into play, that like we have neurochemicals which have these kind of functionality, we think, well, okay, I can see that. So at that point, we have to start thinking, well, how could we invoke more melatonin or whatever by deliberately putting ourselves in situations? Obviously, if it wasn't broken, we wouldn't need to even have these kind of trains of thought.
We wouldn't be thinking about it in the first place. I think it's really interesting that I'm talking to you via a little screen that's called a tablet. Okay, that is one of the sources of this sort of dopamine stimulating addictive behaviour that we're talking about. It's coming to me via a tablet, aptly named, and that tablet is also giving out quite a lot of blue light. And many people out there will have already heard of this, but if you're out there using a tablet or a mobile phone to access content online, it's a good idea to either have an app that puts a kind of a blue light filter across the screen, or just don't use it late in the evening, because our eyes are amazing organs, right? They have obviously the optic nerve that goes into the optical centers of the brain, but also there is another nerve pathway from the retina that is solely designed to register the amount of blue light. And that nerve pathway is responsible to the amount of ambient blue light that's out there in daylight. Okay, so as the daylight levels start to fade later in the day, it senses that the rate of blue light fading has reached a certain point that triggers the release of melatonin. I believe, I'm not a neurochemist, but I believe it's the conversion of serotonin to melatonin. Yeah. So it changes the balance of serotonin and melatonin. And at a certain point in the day, I used to do this with people. I worked on a mental health project for a while. We're taking people out in the woods and doing conservation. And I taught them to notice that point in the day when they suddenly felt as if, oh, you know what, I just want to stop and have a cup of tea. Just feeling that little bit slightly less animated than I was. And that's called the dim light melatonin onset, okay, or DILIMO for short. So I'd get everyone out there to shout DILIMO when they felt it. And depending on the time of year, it would normally happen, in the spring, it's sort of happening around about maybe 4:30, 5 p.m., something like that. They're just starting to just want to stop. There's this natural urge to want to retreat, start packing up, have a cuppa, think about going home. Now, as we get more and more locked into screen reality, this natural cycle is not only getting distorted, but we're losing touch with it. We're actually not sensing it anymore, I think. Wow. And I think that's really, really important. So these screens are literally emitting blue light of a frequency that prevents the dim light melatonin onset, which senses the reduction in the blue part of the spectrum in daylight, preventing that from kicking in and preventing our serotonin melatonin cycle from working properly. And it leads to sleep disturbances and anxiety and all kinds of strange neurochemical effects. So, the idea of not using these kinds of screens late in the day is a really good one. But you can get an app on Android phones. They have some of them now have, I don't know if they do on Apple phones, they have a blue light filter that you can turn on.
So it's inbuilt in
there you go, Tash says it's inbuilt into the iPad as well. So
you set the time on it.
Set the time and it will come on. So
okay.
They are aware of it. I mean, the likes of the multi-million or billionaires at the heads of these huge IT corporations that produce these things are apparently themselves not very keen on having unlimited internet access and lots of screens in their homes.
Well, do you know what? The people who run big sort of heroin smuggling operations probably don't shoot up a lot of heroin either.
Don't either, no. Exactly.
Yeah.
I will leave that one there, I think, and yeah, it's good enough. I just want to say that green light, the light you get in a forest canopy, is incredibly healing. You can just feel it. I want to throw that one out there. But please, everybody, go and get some green light every day if you can manage it.
So is that Fred giving everybody a green light to get some green light?
Yeah.
So it's probably not a coincidence that green light is green light, really, if you think about it. That's it. Yeah, I'm only half joking. I think.
Yeah.
You probably see that green is saying, yeah, go. You can approach. You can move. Yeah.
Yeah.
What I was going to say, just going back to feedback mechanisms. And what you said was really, really interesting around, you were talking about these sort of gatekeepers on our skin and in our gut, which is also our skin, and to do with them testing the food and then saying, yeah, this is good stuff. And I wanted to sort of emphasize that this is good stuff thing, because there's a guy called Preventer who we've done a couple of podcasts with, and he has developed a whole train of thought about nutritional wisdom, but it all hinges around the idea of what he calls flavor feedback mechanisms.
Okay.
Yeah, I just wondered how that would interact with this. So it's spent a lot of time thinking about it. He basically came out with this statement which caught me, absolutely hooked me in, because I knew there's something really deep and profound, even though I didn't understand it on first hearing. It was palates connect animals with landscapes through flavor feedback mechanisms.
Okay.
That was the statement. And so he's talking about animals having the ability to taste the compounds within plants and then therefore register this is good stuff. So he's saying there that the palate is not just on your tongue, but it's in every part of your body. It's at the point of delivery, as well as many other places, in your gut, on your heart, or the point of delivery in the particular tissue or organ that compound goes through. At every point, your body is basically going yum or something like that. This is good stuff. But the point is that the feedback that comes from that creates a situation in which you can have an appetite now for that thing. Whereas until you encountered it and your body was able to check it out and come up with that's good stuff, you couldn't have an appetite for that thing. You could know something was missing, but you would not be able to seek it out in your environment. So he paints this picture of grazing animals because they are exposed from the womb through to birth, breast milk, and then the grazing behavior of the herd, exposed to this is where you get that thing that makes you feel good when you eat it, that there's a feedback mechanism thing going on. I just wondered how that could sort of become a richer picture in light of what you were saying earlier.
I'm loving this, actually, where this is taking my mind anyway. So I know that in recent years there was the discovery that we have taste receptors in all kinds of parts of our body, in places where nobody expected. I mean, even in the testes in blokes, we've got taste receptors. So that's quite bizarre, and it does seem to tally really with what you're saying, that that this whole receptivity based around flavor is a signal. Yeah. We just think of flavor as, is it strawberry or is it vanilla? But no, it's a signal. And it's a signal that we use in all kinds of modalities throughout our whole organism. And it does make me wonder whether, for example, with things like allergies, like asthma, there are certain types of asthma, not all asthma, that can be triggered by the knowledge that something is there. So it can be that the presence of something that somebody can smell can trigger the asthma, and it's actually been, I believe, shown in some cases that it is the smell itself that triggers the asthmatic response. And for a while, people thought that there was this whole train of thought of it's all in people's minds then, which is the biggest load of nonsense. Nothing is all in your mind, not in anyone. It's not all in your mind. Your body is your mind. Okay, it's all one thing. They're not separate. But that really tallies, doesn't it, with the immune idea? Because an asthmatic response can be an immune response, but if you've got a particular taste is perhaps it's the right word, but it should be viewed in a slightly broader context. If you've got a particular taste or a flavor, that is providing a neurological signal. First of all, a chemical signal, then a neurological signal. And if that is partnered at the same time with something that causes an allergic response, then I would have thought forevermore you sort of program yourself that every time you receive that signal, you're also going to rewire that response. Does that make sense? Because it's just another feedback loop. It's just another signaling loop.
But that's a signaling loop gone wrong, though, isn't it? With allergies and so on.
Yes, it is. But it's going back to our original dopamine hypothesis or whatever. It's something that is designed to work in the right way, but has somehow or other it's become corrupted to work in the wrong way. The initial mechanism's a good one, but sometimes it gets broken.
Yeah, so that's the feedback gone wrong. Well, that's an interesting. I think there's a whole bunch of stuff to. I feel like that's a whole bundle of things to explore.
It's a whole, yeah, for sure.
We'll maybe go away and think about that for a year and have another chat about allergies.
I'd love to.
Yeah.
But yeah, in terms of how does that fit into people's relationship with food, and in particular wild food? Because like we were saying, the body has to have lots of systems in place in order to ensure that it gets a really diverse range of good nutrition.
Yeah.
Really the primary impulse behind all of this. And something goes wrong when any one of those feedback mechanisms gets broken. Something goes spinning off out of kilter. So all I can say is, although I don't think any of us probably, and I certainly don't understand the complexity of all of these feedback mechanisms, the one thing that ought to do the most to reset them would be to actually go back to source, go back to the original relationship of actually taking your hands, foraging for something, smelling it, feeling its texture. You then taste it and put it in your mouth, and you have a direct knowing that of where the thing came from, and that the thing that you're tasting is not only that organism, but it's the sum of that organism and all of the other microbes that live within it, and the soil that it drew its nutrients from, and all of the rest of it, and completely creating or recreating that entire loop from scratch. I'd like to just quickly tell you the story of Mr. Brown, if that's okay. A number of years ago, I did a stint working on a project on a farm, and the place was set up for people with severe autism. And there was a chap called Mr. Brown. He was a man in his late 30s, and he required constant care. So he couldn't change his own clothes, he couldn't speak, needed help with feeding in the conventional way if you were to sit down and eat a plate of food. But when we went for a walk out on the farm, and he had his permanent full-time carers with him, when we went for a walk, he would literally bound around like a gazelle. He didn't walk, he leapt. He leapt through the air, sprang from step to step. And when he found a plant that called to him, he would stop and bend over and examine it. And he would always put a bit of it in his mouth and chew it. And then he would either spit it out or he'd swallow it. And every time this happened, his carers completely freaked out. They're like, get it out of your mouth, wash your mouth out. It could be poison and all the rest of it. But this guy had been doing this for 38 years. And not once had he made himself sick, ever. Now, by the law of probability, if anyone was just randomly consuming plants out of the hedgerow and it was a random event, after 38 years, they would have, at the very least, seriously poisoned themselves and probably not be there. Okay, I mean, there are plenty of things out there. If he'd have just stubbed a load of hemlock water dropper in his mouth and swallowed it, he probably would have only been around for half an hour or something. I don't know. But he'd never once harmed himself. So one assumes that, or I assume that his innate animal instinctual sense of how to sense, through the mucous membranes and through the nerves in his lips and through smell and everything else was so highly attuned that what he was doing was sampling things and just going, yeah, okay, that's fine. No, that's not fine. And he used to spit 3 times, and then just move on and off to the next thing. But he would just feed himself all day long from the hedgerows. Much to the chagrin of the people looking after him, who were absolutely terrified that he was going to go and top himself and they'd all get sued. So there's something in there. Mr. Brown, I think, taught me a big lesson, that there is some innate principle that can be trusted. Yeah. That people cannot go, okay, well, I think I'm just in tune with nature. I'll be fine. I'll just go and eat whatever I want. Because, guys, if there's anyone out there who thinks that and you're listening, you're probably going to die if you do that, okay? I'm telling you that there is a principle out there that I believe is there. It's powerful. It can be tuned into and it can guide you. But the difference between us and Mr. Brown is that Mr. Brown was way, way more in tune with his instinctive
Yeah.
nature than any non-autistic person I have ever met.
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, I've met someone who is a very dear friend. Actually, I wouldn't dream of saying who it was, but not from the UK, and came to the UK, deep plant knowledge, deep relationship with land and so on. But unfortunately, he was eating groundsel, which, as you know, has liver damaging alkaloids in it, and told me that the plant had told him it was good salad.
Oh dear.
I'm like, okay, I can't deny that there's some possible sphere that you could enter into, like Mr. Brown does, yeah, where you would know that and it would be accurate. But you're wrong about that.
Yeah.
This is a poisonous plant. The plant did not tell you that. That was some spooky zone in your head. And this wasn't a fluffy hippie either. It was, but
yeah,
he was wrong about that. So it's a dangerous space to try and step into.
Not one to experiment with.
Not one to experiment with. You're better off just learning your plant ID and the things, and then maybe explore some subtle nuances that aren't quite so dangerous with your
I completely agree.
Yeah.
You know, our relationship with the natural world on that intuitive level is pretty damaged. So we need to learn to trust it more. That's really important. But at the point when you put something in your mouth and swallow it, you are 100% committed. And to be honest, you need to be 110% sure of its identification and also what it can do to you before you go that far. Because, you know, otherwise the potential is one of natural selection. You're going to get selected out, basically.
Yeah. All the people that tell me they're too scared to forage, I always say this is a great start. This is an excellent start.
Definitely.
Being too scared to forage is the best possible way to start, because you're going to be careful now. But there's just one other story I'd like to just maybe round things off with, because it's an unanswered question, other than that this is an example of something instinctual like Mr. Brown. But I met a chap in Brazil, and we were sitting opposite. He said, well, what do you do? And me and my mate said, well, we're foragers. And that's great. He said, I need to talk to you about something. Oh, really? He says, yes, I'm a primatologist. I work with mainly a species called tamarins in the Amazon. And we've had to relocate some tamarins because of, the forest was going to be felled, and we at least had the chance to get the animals out and move them to a suitable habitat. So we took these tamarins and we took them to another habitat in which there were plants growing, which we know because it's my particular interest to study the diet of the tamarind. There are plants here that not only don't occur where they came from, but nothing like them occurs where they came from. So they've had zero exposure. We opened the cage, the tamarind came out, walked straight up to this plant, grabbed the leaf without hesitation, put it in their mouth, ate it, and carried on.
Wow.
So that was an example of absolute direct. There wasn't even any reflection going on. And I actually raised this with Mr. Provenza. It may be that I didn't understand the subtlety of what he said, but I feel that this was something that even with all the experience he had, he couldn't quite furnish us with an explanation. So, because all of his stuff is mainly based around the flavor feedback and the stuff. Whereas this, none of that was involved. It was direct. They knew this plant was good, and they were right.
That's really interesting. That's so interesting. Phenomenal.
Ancestral knowledge, who knows? Yeah.
Cellular, maybe cellular based.
But they didn't do it. Just to qualify it, they were offered bananas. Yeah. And they didn't know about bananas.
Okay.
Later on, they learned to eat bananas. This leaf they knew about. They passed the bananas by and went straight to the leaf on this tree.
Steve, we've got to remember something, that millions of years ago we didn't just arrive, we didn't just sort of pop up and go, bing, I'm the first human. We evolved from a microbial soup.
Yeah.
So we've gone through we've gone through a couple of billions of years worth of evolution, through which we've been many different kinds of organisms, and we've co-evolved with the things that we used as nutrition. Yeah. We didn't discover them. We grew with them, within them, around them, and co-evolved with them.
Yeah.
And so there must be some types of knowing that originate from that, I believe anyway, from that really primal stratum of our existence.
Yep.
That could well be an example of one of them. I just had another very brief thought of something I'd like to say. One of the things I recently discovered through being a student is that, and this is just a bit of a tangent, but with this virus going around, I think I'd like to tell the world, and it's about food, is that our neutrophils, which are, possibly our most numerous white blood cells and are at the front line of our innate immune system, these cells they literally start off in our bloodstream and they go through the walls of the blood vessels and actually migrate to sites of inflammation where infection is occurring, and they're able to phage cells that are infected with a virus. So they actually are one of the very, very first responses, and because they're so numerous, they go en masse to the site of an infection in our bodies. But the receptors on them, and the receptors that bind to substances called chemokines that actually set off this reaction, or maybe it's not those receptors, actually, it might be a different receptor on the cell surface, I don't know. The receptors bind to sugars in the bloodstream. And there have been some studies that have shown that the concentration of refined sugars, whether it's sucrose, glucose, or fructose, but raw sugars, in a sort of non-complex state in the bloodstream, the levels of those sugars affects those neutrophil cells. It actually dopes them and stops responding to the presence of a threat. So the very front line of our immune system, the very first kind of response from the innate immune system, this is not the learned response. This is the one that just recognizes patterns of things that are non-human and out of kilter, and goes to the site and deals with them. That more primitive part of our immune system is the first response, or the innate response, and the very first part of it is the triggering of neutrophils to go to the site where things have been breached. And if the neutrophils in the blood have been doped with sugar in the blood, they don't respond properly. So I just want everyone to ponder on that. There's a really quite an infectious virus going on at the moment in this world that hopefully one day we'll listen to this podcast and it will be a long time ago, but who knows? And it may well be just from this one bit of basic biology teaching that I've received, maybe that the neutrophils themselves can be affected by our consumption of refined sugars. And perhaps for those listening out there, guys, it might be an idea at the moment with this threat going on to keep your sugar consumption down to really quite a low level in order that your frontline defenses from your immune system can be mobilized quicker. There you go.
Well, that sounds like a very helpful piece of advice, and it's certainly no downside to that. Cut down on your sugar.
Well, yeah, win-win probably anyway.
Yeah. All right, Fred. Well, it's been smashing to talk to you. Yeah.
You too. Really enjoyed it, actually. We should do it more often.
Yeah, we should.
Okay, well, thanks for listening to this week's Worldwide podcast. And since this conversation, I've had a chance to look up something that I referred to and couldn't remember the name of. So there's a book called Pure, White and Deadly. That's by a guy called John Yudkin. So you can look that up. But it was published in the 70s, but republished with a foreword by a guy called Robert Lustig. And he's a pretty interesting guy too. He's written a book called The Hacking of the American Mind, The Science Behind the Corporate Takeover of Our Bodies and Brains. So that's highly relevant to the conversation we've just had. And in fact, we'll put a video on the podcast page, a link on the podcast page to where he's basically expounding the main ideas in that book. And there's a lot of reference to dopamine and serotonin systems, and indeed, people basically going after that pursuit of the distorted appetite that I referred to in the introduction. So those are good things to follow up if you want to explore some of these ideas in a bit more depth. And now to get to the weekly bit about plants. So there's a couple of things I would suggest you look out for this week. One is just coming into season, and the other has gone out of season, but it's a great time to spot it. So I'll start with the latter. So I mentioned lamb's lettuce a few weeks ago as being this amazing winter hardy salad. But I have to say, the first time we found lamb's lettuce Actually, it's a great story, so I'll tell it. And forgive me if I've told it before. I sometimes forget what I've said on the podcast, but it's worth retelling if I have. We were on this sort of quest for lamb's lettuce when Ali and I were first discovering some of the wild plants. We were in Cornwall, armed with Carluccio's Goes Wild book, which was kind of our Bible at the time for learning just a few wild edibles and really delicious recipes to make them palatable to serve up on the table. So yeah, I'd highly recommend that book if you're just getting started for just basic recipes that really work. Anyway, we'd been scouring everywhere in the vicinity of Ali's parents in Cornwall, where we were trying to find lamb's lettuce. Every walk I was looking everywhere and not finding it. And then just the day the day we were just about to leave, I went out for one last look and found this plant growing at the base of a wall just outside the house next door. And I recognized it as lamb's lettuce based on the leaves. But the thing is, it had basically gone to seed, so that it made it a lot easier to spot. I was able to take the leaf. They're the right shape, but slightly smaller. That's what happens when the plant goes to flower and goes to seed. But the reason I know it was seed and not flower is because I gathered the seeds, and also because I had my eye in for what the plant looked like at that point, I gathered a lot more seeds on the way out through various villages. We spotted it again at the base of the wall in lots of the villages, walls of houses, as we drove past on the way back. So by the time we got home, we had a bag full of these lamb's lettuce plants with seeds ready to scatter in our vicinity. So I thought, well, we'll get this growing near us, I hope. Well, the next morning I went out to scatter the seeds in similar habitats, just on this little housing estate where we were living, see if we could get it growing up from the bases of walls there, and on just little scratchy little rough bits of ground there. And one of my neighbours sort of stopped me and asked me what I was up to, and I showed her the plant and said, I'm scattering these seeds trying to get it to grow. And she said, oh well, you needn't bother, come and follow me. And she took me to her back garden where there was an absolute forest of this lamb's lettuce. And while we were still living in that place, I several times went and picked lamb's lettuce. I've never actually seen lamb's lettuce growing in quite such abundance anywhere since then. It was just an absolute carpet of it. And of course, it gave us this very, very kind of introductory lesson, which continues to be one of the central points to be made about foraging, which is that what you have is within reach. It's in fact, it's probably pretty much right on your doorstep. So we felt we'd kind of been made monkeys out of to come back with our hoard of lamb's lettuce seeds, hoping to propagate them in Kent, completely needlessly because the lamb's lettuce have been all the time. So that's the thing that's gone out of season. But if you, I can't. It looks a little like forget-me-not, the flowers. They're paler, but they're slightly sort of greyish, almost seemingly a little bit lilac. Although if you go up close, they look kind of more white, but they do look a bit like forget-me-not. But in all sort of realism, anyone listening to this can just go and look up on the internet for images of lamb's lettuce in flower, all gone to seed, and that's what you're going to find just now. And it's a lot more easy to spot really than the little leaves that you'll find when it's more edible at a more edible stage. And this is actually a thing that is worth bearing in mind across the board. Now, whether we're talking about nettles or lamb's lettuce or something like roseberry, willow herb, or even Japanese knotweed, these plants leave skeletons once they've finished growing, which make them very visible. An even more salient point to be made right now is that flowers have a similar effect of attracting attention from further away. So if you want to find just a little leaf, you have to be right close up and looking in exactly the right spot, which you may not. Whereas these tall skeletons of a plant or the plant in its flowering stage are just much more visible from a distance, and they can enable you to home in on a patch of something. For example, dandelions just now, although some of them have already gone to seed, but a lot of dandelion plants are still with their bright yellow flower heads. And that means you can really scope out your neighborhood and find out where the dandelions are and either write it down or you've got a really good memory, just bear it in mind, or photograph it, or even get a GPS thing on it, because that means you can go back year round and you'll be able to find these leaves. So just getting to the thing that's coming into season, fat hen and closely related plants like spear-leaved orach, all of which are in the spinach family or the goosefoot family, and closely related to quinoa and samphire and beetroot, in fact, as well as spinach, obviously. These plants are just coming into season now with just little seedlings, which are so small and delicate, but absolutely delicious in salads. So again, if you want to know what they look like, if you've ever grown quinoa, well, fat hen looks almost identical to quinoa, but these are small plants and they're growing. Again, you might find them growing at the base of the wall somewhere, just in sort of rough ground, or if you're lucky enough to have a garden that's got disturbed ground, there you're going to find little bits of fat hen, and even on arable farmland. So it's really delicious in salads. When it's more mature, you're more likely to cook that down as greens, and then later in the year you can even harvest the seeds and they're like a miniature quinoa. But just now, look out for fat hen and wild orach, and they can be used in salads. So as ever, do look at the www.forager.org.uk/podcast page to get all the notes that we've put with this and links and so on. And check out Fred. We'll be putting some details up of Fred's website and various other bits and bobs that will allow you to explore a bit more of his work. Okay, well, that's it. And thanks again for listening to this week's World Wild podcast.
Is forming still under the awning of love. In the light of the morning, creation is forming still under the awning of love. And if you just would come, bring us back where we belong, then the waters will run. And if you just would come, remove the walls and make the bond strong, then the waters will run. springing up inside of you brings union. And behold, there's this new thing springing up inside of you.